hundreds of thousands of black people were basically sold into slavery. I mean, every railroad in the South was done with convict labor.
Let's talk about an overlooked and alarming truth that many people don't know about. So to start, I'll ask this question. Did you know that slavery is still legal in America today? Yes, you heard that right. Slavery may have officially ended on December 6, 1865, with the passing of the 13th Amendment abolishing chattel slavery, but a practice called convict leasing emerged, and that essentially perpetuated the system of slavery, just in a different form.
When you go to the 13th Amendment, one of the fascinating things about the text of that amendment is that it says that slavery is abolished, except in the case of a punishment for a crime. And within that wiggle room, what you see in it is that there's still the possibility of extending slavery, as it were, by another name.
There's an exception under the 13th Amendment that allows for legalized slavery as punishment for a crime. And this exception has been used to pass laws that criminalize and re-enslave people, particularly black people, through practices such as convict leasing, where incarcerated people are leased to private businesses for forced labor.
In state after state and county after county, new laws targeted African Americans and effectively criminalized black life.
Convict leasing was a system of prison labor used mainly in the southern United States from 1884 until 1928. In convict leasing, state-run prisons profited from contracting with private parties such as plantations, railroads, and coal mines to provide them with convict labor. The lessees, which were the private parties, assumed all costs of housing, feeding, and overseeing the convicts. So when initially used during that time frame, convict leasing was a brutal practice, as the conditions created by convict leasing could be worse than those during slavery. Starvation and beatings were normal, and the human consequences were inconsequential. In fact, throughout the South, annual death rates ranged from 16% to 25% during convict leasing, and these death rates were approximately 10 times the death rates of prisoners in non-leased states. For example, in 1873, 25% of all black leased convicts died. But again, since this convict leasing system generated wealth for the states and the companies involved, it continued with no regard for the prisoners' working conditions or the ongoing loss of life. Another stat is this one. After the passing of the 13th Amendment, more than 800,000 black people were part of the system of this re-enslavement process through the prison system. So let's take a look at two of those southern states, Alabama and Arkansas, and their usage of convict leasing after the end of the Civil War. Alabama and its counties made money out of the convict lease system from 1875 until 1928 by employing prisoners on farms, in lumber yards, and in coal mines. The state and municipal governments were able to provide labor to businesses and individuals at a lesser cost. After being found guilty, inmates were sent to labor right away to finish out their sentences. The state penitentiary in Wetumpka, which is located in Elmore County, was used to house state offenders who were declared incapable to labor. All female convicts were deported to Wetumpka beginning in 1888. However, there weren't many detainees at the Wetumpka camp. In Alabama, the vast majority of inmates were employed by private businesses, which contributed significantly to the state and local economies. Nearly all of the 3,000 state and county criminals employed under the convict leasing system by the 1880s resided in the Birmingham area. The history of the system is convoluted. In Alabama, inmates have been obliged to work while being watched by a state warden since the antebellum era. After the Civil War, African Americans were increasingly incarcerated in county jails and the state penitentiary as a result of social and political unrest, poverty, and a discriminatory judicial system.
In Mississippi, theft of a pig worth as little as $1 could mean 5 years in prison. In Tennessee, hard labor might result from stealing an 8-cent fence rail.
In the 1860s and 1870s, county inmates with prior convictions were forced to labor in factories and on a state-run farm, respectively. State inmates with criminal convictions worked on the railroads, where their fatality rates were relatively high. Despite saving the state money on housing and feeding them, railroad companies did not pay the state for the prison labor they used. Before Alabama was forced to explore for alternative sources of funding in 1875 due to a financial crisis, leasing inmates did not help the state or the counties. John G. Bass, the state's warden, put into effect a new rule allowing the state to rent certain prisoners to different farms, lumber yards, and farms in exchange for monthly payments. Based on their physical prowess and ability levels, Bass divided prisoners into 3 categories and set charges appropriately.
Southern states had a history of placing prisoners with industries that would bear the cost of guarding and housing them in exchange for their labor. Now states also began to charge fees, renting prisoners to companies by the month. The highest rates were for the strongest workers and longest sentences.
The state's revenue increased right away, and in the first year, it produced a profit of between $11,000 and $12,000. That amount is over $304,000 to over $331,000 in today's dollar.
By 1890, revenue was $164,000, roughly $4.1 million today. By then, states throughout the South and hundreds of counties and cities were engaged in some form of leasing convicts to private industry.
As soon as county governments became aware of the possible financial windfall, they started organizing their own lease deals with businesses. County criminals were required to pay all court costs in addition to the time served as punishment for their crimes, which was frequently done by serving lengthy sentences. These county detainees, who were regularly found guilty of misdemeanors, were sometimes sentenced to extended terms of gruesome hard labor because they lacked the money to pay for their arrests and prosecutions.
And it gave tremendous discretionary power for the private owner, either a landowner or a corporation or a coal mine, could be any business concern, to do what they wanted with that African American.
These prisoners frequently resided in abhorrent conditions, were malnourished, endured horrific treatment and torture, and got no protection from the labor companies who exploited them. Most of the female prisoners in the state were forced to work on prison farms that were managed by the state. The evolving convict leasing system came to a crossroads in 1883. The state government devised a structure that leased the majority of prisoners to a small number of coal owners as a result of the financial changes pushed by Warden John Hollis Bankhead. Under a 10-year agreement that TCI obtained in 1888, all physically capable state prisoners were made available to the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, or TCI for short, the Pratt Coal and Iron Company, and the Sloss Iron and Steel Company. TCI agreed to pay the state $9 to $18.50 a month, depending on the individual needs of each prisoner. The jails were constructed and maintained by the coal corporations in accordance with Bankhead's idea, and they were primarily situated in the coal-rich regions surrounding Birmingham.
The business owner would have absolute dominion over the black person for the period of time of the lease. But once you were in the system, you could spend the rest of your life there. And that was a direct consequence of the reality of being a convict lease and having to fight literally to survive day by day.
The largest prison mines were Coalburg, run by Sloss, using county inmates, and Slope 2 and Shaft, run by TCI in Pratt City. In 1883, Bankhead established a new board of inspectors, which was another modification. The inspectors were in charge of monitoring inmate care, ensuring timely release of offenders, and inspecting the security of mines and other prison labor locations. Since none of these tasks were taken seriously, prisoners who were released to coal mines had the highest fatality rates of any business that used prison labor. Following Bankhead's resignation in 1885, the warden position was eliminated. Reginald H. Dawson, a political rookie whose brother was a well-known Democrat and possible governor, was appointed chief inspector. As the successful administrator, Dawson gradually mediated the conflict between the mining companies and the inmates with the help of his two deputies, William D. Lee of Perry County and Dr. Albert T. Henley of Marengo County. This created a triangle inside the convict lease system between the Board of Inspectors, the prisoners, the coal firms, and other smaller contractors.
In 1884, a series of remarkable letters was sent from the Pratt coal mines to Alabama's new inspector of prisons. Their author was Ezekiel Archie, now a 25-year-old convict.
All these years of how we suffered, we have looked death in the face, worked hungry, thirsty, half-clothed, and sore.
90% of state inmates and more than 95% of county inmates were black, and the most frequent method of punishment was whipping. The use of flogging to deter escape attempts and impose labor discipline by contractors has led some to label the arrangement as a new type of slavery. You think? Think about this. Black people were whipped during slavery, and whipped again during this new slavery known as convict leasing. And when one considers that the original jail architects like John W. Comer and Gaius Whitfield were also slave owners, it becomes pretty clear how much slavery influenced the institution. In contrast to slaves, however, convicts could serve out their terms before being released, and many of them had some sort of education. They also qualified for additional pay for working past their daily quota if they met it. Regular prison inspections were carried out by Dawson, Henley, and Lee, who also implemented some changes that benefited state prisoners. Dawson gave the Board of Inspectors instructions to lessen workloads and sanctions, permit prisoners to send and receive letters, and assist Julia Strudwick Tutwiler's state-of-the-art prison institutions. By giving each prisoner a time card that included details on their conviction and release dates, the inspectors were able to keep track of the terms served by inmates. The inmates were aware of their release date and had the ability to alert the inspectors if it wasn't carried out. The board played a major role in the management of the state's convict lease system and was crucial to its survival. In the middle of the 19th century, Arkansas adopted the convict lease system for managing state prisons. The Arkansas system, which was comparable to that of other southern states at the time, represented the desire to reduce the cost and administrative problems with the state's jails. Although the system achieved its economic goals, it was plagued by corruption and inhumane treatment of prisoners, which ultimately contributed to its downfall. When the state hired Hodges, P. and Aliff in 1867 to provide employment for inmates in the penitentiary in Little Rock, which was Pulaski County, it was during the Reconstruction era and the first time that convict leases were employed in Arkansas. The state also purchased the necessary equipment to set up a factory inside the prison, in addition to agreeing to pay the firm 35 cents per day for the support of the prisoners. One of the numerous people who oversaw the jails from 1869 through 1873 was Asa Hodges, a well-known Little Rock-based Republican politician. It seems like running the prison was profitable. In addition to giving offenders work inside the prison walls, the jail lessee typically recruited inmates to labor elsewhere in the community. As Reconstruction came to an end in 1873, The state government modified its prison lease policy and stopped paying the lessee to support the prisoners. Inmates were leased to John M. Peck under the terms of the deal made that year, and Peck and Colonel Zebulon Ward, his silent partner, were in charge of giving them jobs, lodging, food, and other requirements. The state wasn't meant to have to pay anything. Ward bought Peck in 1875 and held onto the contract with the prison until 1883. Ward made a sizable profit from his contract as the state's prison population rapidly increased between 1876 and 1882 as a result of the legislature enacting a law in 1875 making the theft of any property valued at $2 or more punishable by 1 to 5 years in prison. Talk about some bullshit there. Ward was also tasked with hiring prisoners to construct a sizable extension to the state jail. In 1883, there was yet another substantial change to the convict lease system. In the lease negotiated that year, Arkansas adopted the practice of other southern states by requiring the lessee to pay the state for convict labor. Since the lease system had grown to be a considerable source of state income, it was extremely difficult to abolish. Planters in Helena, which was in Phillips County, named J.P. Townsend and L.A. Fitzpatrick, won the 1883 lease, and they later upheld the contract with Met L. Jones as a business called the Arkansas Industrial Company. While hundreds of inmates were sent outside to work for outside businesses, some prisoners at the jail continued to get employment from the Arkansas Industrial Company. Inmates in camps around the state worked on farms, built railroads, and mined coal in the Coal Hill, which was in the Johnson County region of western Arkansas, according to a prison report from 1890. There was a lot of corruption brought about by the system of convict leases. Early lessees contributed nothing to the maintenance of prisoners since they got governmental subsidies. Later, to find cheap laborers who didn't need proper care, subcontractors and contractors hired jail labor. A parliamentary committee investigated the Coal Hill camp's facilities in 1888 because of the seriousness of the problems. A prison inspector began inspecting and documenting the circumstances in each camp in 1890. These examinations showed that convicts had problems with overcrowding, inadequate housing, food and clothing. Health and hygiene facilities were lacking. Additionally, the guards harshly punished them while abusing them verbally and physically.
The thing about convict leasing, it was worse than slavery because during slavery, as bad as it sounds, the enslaved individuals were an investment for the slave owner. Therefore, the slave owner did not want to kill or destroy their investment. Under the convict leasing, they worked individuals to death because if those convicts died, then the state just sent replacement convicts.
Contractors for the prison camps also neglected to keep security up, which led to numerous escapes. The Knights of Labor and farmer organizations like the Agricultural Will and the Farmers Alliance pushed for the system to be abolished after 1888, as concerns about the conditions in the camps were brought up in state politics. The legislature first tried to alter the situation in 1893 when it opted not to renew the lease with the Arkansas Industrial Company. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough money from the state to build up a system that would have let the state properly support the prisoners. As the state assumed control of the inmates' administration, it instead established its own subcontracting system by hiring prisoners to work as sharecroppers on farms, as railroad employees, and in other companies throughout the state.
After emancipation, industrialists replaced slaves with convicts, acquiring thousands from state and county governments.
You can't drive free labor the same way that you can force prisoners to mine 5 tons of coal a day.
All the atrocities between 1888 and 1890 continued when the state put its prisoners under the watch of private contractors. In his opening address to the legislature in 1909, Progressive Democrat Governor George Donahue called for the elimination of the leasing system. Even though they agreed with the concept, The lawmakers refused to set aside the money required to construct a prison farm big enough to house every prisoner in the state. Donaghy made the decision to abolish the system in 1912, determine how many offenders could be held on the existing state farm close to Grady, which was in Lincoln County, and then released enough inmates to reduce the population to that number. The leases were technically terminated the following year when the legislature acquired land in Jefferson County for a larger prison farm, now known as the Tucker Unit. But Donaghy effectively put a halt to the practice.
And this system is one that I think in many ways needs to be understood as brutal in a social sense, but fiendishly rational in an economic sense. Because where else could one take a black worker and work them literally to death after slavery? And when that worker died, one simply had to go and get another convict.
Now, let's look at present day. Even though federal and state laws prohibited convict leasing for most of the 20th century, the once notorious practice is making a comeback. Today, prisons are once again leasing inmates to private companies or public agencies for labor. Under these lucrative agreements, states are increasingly leasing prisoners to private corporations to harvest food for American consumers. Think about that the next time you eat anything bought from your local grocery store. And once again, the prisons and the growers benefit from this system by reducing incarceration costs while paying below minimum wage to the prisoners. Currently, states such as Arizona, Idaho, and Washington that grow labor-intensive crops like onions, apples, and tomatoes are leasing convicts to growers desperate for workers. And incarcerated workers in the U.S. produce at least $11 billion in goods and services annually, but receive just pennies an hour in wages for their prison jobs, according to a new report from the American Civil Liberties Union. Each prison system and state legislature determines how prison labor is regulated and paid. Typically, wages range from 14 cents to $2 an hour for prison maintenance labor, depending on the state where the inmate is incarcerated. The national average hovers around 63 cents per hour for this type of labor. But in some states, prisoners work for free. So the lower the wages paid to prisoners, the higher the profits for the states and private companies.
That continues all the way to the present, where even today, about just under 40% of the nation's prisoners are black, and yet the African American population is about 13%. They are snatching up bodies everywhere to fuel this system.
Greed, greed, greed. And just like after the Civil War, today, mass incarceration disproportionately affects marginalized communities, with people of color and those from low-income backgrounds being the primary victims. Moreover, according to recent data, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with over 2 million people behind bars. So it's no surprise that private companies and state governments continue to profit from the system by capitalizing on the cheap labor provided by prison populations. Now, many organizations and activists are tirelessly fighting to bring an end to this exploitative system. They advocate for prison reform, fair labor practices, and rehabilitation programs that focus on education and reintegration. But we still need legislative reforms that prioritize rehabilitation and provide alternative sentencing options, rather than perpetuating a cycle of incarceration. But let's face it, convict leasing is a highly profitable industry. Companies can save millions by hiring incarcerated individuals, as they are not entitled to the same benefits or protections as regular workers. Yes, it's a modern-day form of exploitation, but more on point, convict leasing is modern-day slavery. Plain and simple. And there is no end to it in sight because of the profitability possibilities to private companies and state governments. So I am pretty sure that more and more state governments will begin using this system, which is another example of the shadows we often neglect to see in American history. What are your thoughts? Do you think convict leasing should be stopped? Or are you okay with it happening today? Thank you for joining us today on this eye-opening journey. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to Buffy's World for more insightful takes on overlooked events in American history. And as always, we encourage you to leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And remember, knowledge is power, and together we can make a difference. So stay informed, take action, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.